Welcome once again to Lehto's Law. Here's Steve Lehto.
I think most people know that if you have an ambulance coming up behind you while you're on the road, you hear the sirens, you see the lights, you pull over and let them pass you. And you'd think that most people would get that by now, but Mojo sent me a note. He said, Steve, even over here in England, we sometimes have bad drivers. And he used different words to describe bad drivers, but I'll go with bad drivers because this is a family-friendly program. From ITV.com, a driver repeatedly blocking an ambulance in Reading is worst case ever seen by emergency service, and the man is going to jail because he did this. This is crazy. A man repeatedly blocked paramedics as they were on their way to an emergency. He's now been sentenced for that. Paramedics in a marked ambulance for South Central Ambulance Service were driving along the A4 Bath Road, responding to a medical emergency of a collapsed man. The ambulance overtook a red Suzuki Vitara being driven by a 38-year-old man we'll refer to now as the defendant. The defendant then overtook the ambulance, pulling directly in front of it and braking, slowing the ambulance down. So he pulled in front of him, pulled the old brake check. The ambulance continued along the A4, and the defendant continued to overtake other members of the public who'd pulled over. So other people were pulling over, but he was passing them and staying in front of the ambulance. He then slowed down again, blocking the ambulance's path. He continued to block the path of the ambulance along Wargrave Road, where he continued to brake heavily, weave in the road, and encroach onto the wrong side of the road occasionally. The paramedic who was driving the ambulance along with a student paramedic says that she had never experienced an incident like it in her whole career. She said it's just become clear that he was intent on stopping us from progressing, and he was just trying to stay in front of us and just keep slowing us down. It threw me so much, and we just had to let our control know that this was happening. We were still trying to get ahead of him. And control, I assume she means the headquarters of the people that they talk to on the old hoot and holler. It felt like he was playing with us. He'd upset us so much that we had to just steady ourselves before we could keep on going to the patient. So they're trying to get to somebody who needs medical aid. They pass this guy, and he comes around, passes them, gets in front of them, starts doing the old brake check thing, and he's weaving around, and he's clearly trying to impede their progress getting to the emergency they've been called for. At one point, he stopped, and I thought he was going to get out of the car and attack us, but luckily, he decided then that he'd had enough. Meanwhile, the director of operations at SCAS said, this was the worst standard of driving suffered by one of our hardworking ambulance crews who were responding on blue lights to a potentially very serious emergency that I have ever seen. The defendant was sentenced to 8 months in prison. The guy got 8 months in prison for this idiotic thing he did. He was also suspended for 18 months after pleading guilty to dangerous driving and obstructing or hindering an emergency worker. And it turns out, by the way, that this is against the law. Who'd have thought? He was also ordered to complete 20 hours of rehabilitation activity requirement days, 200 hours of unpaid work over an 18-month period, and he was banned from driving for 3 years and ordered to pay costs of £600. Investigating Officer Sergeant Matt Cadmore said the manner of his driving was completely unacceptable. I'm deliberately attempting to hinder the progress of this ambulance. He was putting other road at great risk and at the same time delaying an emergency vehicle en route to a medical emergency. This sort of behavior on our roads will not be tolerated and will take robust action against anybody who seeks to drive in this manner. And the weird thing about this is, I was thinking about this, and I've heard of people who've been ticketed because they didn't get out of the way fast enough, or they somehow weren't paying attention and they didn't get out of the way at all, or somehow there's an emergency situation and they somehow didn't do what they're supposed to do. But those are very, very rare, and it's usually because somebody is just really not paying attention, also really driving really stupidly, and usually they did something where they piled onto that by being rude to the police officers or something. But here somebody appears to have been actively messing with an ambulance that had its lights and sirens on. And I don't even know what to say as to why somebody might do that. But nowadays, it seems like all bets are off. Anytime you think to yourself, that's something I've never heard of before, well, something else will happen tomorrow that has you saying the exact same thing. But somebody in a car, remember, he got passed by the ambulance the first time. He sped up and passed them, got in front of them, started doing the old brake check thing, and at one point came to a complete stop to make them stop. Presumably, because of the lights and sirens, they're going to an emergency. He knows that. He knows that. So strangely, there's no mention in here of what his explanation was if he had one. And he might have just chosen not to say anything. And he may have just been put on trial, and there you go. But it's one of the craziest driving things I've ever heard of. Because usually the crazy driving stuff is you hear like, oh, some car got out on the freeway and was doing like 190 miles per hour, and they wouldn't stop for the police. And you think to yourself, oh, okay. So if they get away with that, it's one thing. They don't get away with it, they're going to have the book thrown at them. But usually, like I said, excessive speed, yeah. Or, people who block the intersections and do donuts and people film it and so on. Those things make the news. But is any of that in the same league as somebody intentionally blocking an ambulance? Now, there's no mention here of what happened, if anything, as a result of the ambulance getting there late. And I know that ambulances sometimes get called as a matter of routine, and they show up, and the person that they're there to treat is sitting on the curb going, actually, I feel okay. I think they called an ambulance because I mentioned that they said, are you okay? And I said, I wasn't sure, that kind of thing. And I've been in a car accident before. I've owned several vehicles that have been rear-ended. It's the weirdest thing. And when you get hit real hard, for a minute or two, you can actually think to yourself, I'm not sure if I'm okay. And a little bit later, you go, oh, I think I'm okay. So once in a while, they pull the trigger too fast and do get an ambulance. And it might be that they got there and there's nothing to do. But that doesn't matter because the law says lights and sirens coming up behind you, get over. Get over. It doesn't say lights and sirens, get over, unless you're feeling kind of playful today and you want to mess with the ambulance driver. So it is a crazy story. Again, it's from the ITV, and the man was sentenced to 8 months in prison, a suspended sentence for 18 more, after pleading guilty to dangerous driving, and also ordered to complete 20 days of rehabilitation activity, 200 hours of community service, and banned from driving for 3 years and costs of £600. So the man is going to prison for messing with the ambulance that was trying to get where it was going. Crazy story. He repeatedly blocked the ambulance, and it was the worst case ever seen by emergency services. Mojo Senate, thanks a lot. Questions or comments, put them below. Otherwise, talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching Lehto's Law. The best way to choose what to keep and what to throw away is hold each item and ask, does this spark joy? If it does, keep it. This is not only the simplest, but the most accurate yardstick by which to judge.